But today I wanted to talk about a subject that's become interesting to me, partly because I've become a painter. And for a very long time ago, when I was very, very young, actually I studied aesthetics and with a man by the name of John Hospers, who wrote a book called Meaning and Truth in the Arts, and was really quite interested in representation and theories of representation. And I was impressed both with what he had to say and then with subsequent figures like, say, Nelson Goodman. And I became convinced at the time that really there was nothing more to be said on these topics. And so I abandoned 40 years ago, almost now, 40 years ago, aesthetics until I started to paint. And when I started to paint, then it seemed to me that the standard theories of representation had to be wrong, and had to be wrong in rather interesting ways. So I want to talk about representation and consciousness, and I want to talk about them from the standpoint of the artist. At least that's going to be the point of view that I'm going to begin with. I then want to finally turn around a bit this picture and look at issues of representation from the standpoint of the spectator, and indeed from a more social and perhaps intersubjective point of view. But I want to start out from the standpoint of the artist. And what I want to do first is to draw some distinctions. I'm going to use some terminology, standard terminology, in a fairly technical way. At least I hope technical is perhaps too fancy a word for it, but in a perhaps systematic and consistent manner. So when I think about painting, I'm going to, and speak about painting, I want to speak about the content of a painting. So there's a certain content to this painting that I'm showing you. Actually, the content of it happens to be Keith Lehrer, as some of you might have figured out. So there's a content of that painting. You might think it looks like me, you might think it doesn't. But there is a man in the painting that you can see. There's also a man here. You might compare the two. So there's a certain content or object in the painting, I'm going to say. And I want to distinguish between the object or content of the painting on the one hand and the model or subject of the painting on the other. In this case, of course, the model for the painting was me, or at least my image in a mirror. And I was the subject of the painting. So what I want to do is define a set of problems about representation. I'm going to speak about representation and representational painting, but ultimately I hope that what I have to say will connect representational painting with abstract painting. In fact, I think that's a desideratum. There's something about, at least it is for me, there's something about representational painting that connects in a fairly natural way with abstract painting. Abstract painting may be abstract, but it's about something usually. Not always. There are extreme cases of painters that were very concerned in abstract painting to try to paint something that wasn't about anything. And some of them may have succeeded. But I think usually that's not what happens. I think that we are, so to speak, inveterate generalizers, secreting conceptions as we experience the sensory world. So I think there is a continuity between the two. And I think a good theory of representational painting should provide us with some basis for understanding a connection between the two. Again, there are some first-person components in this for me. I slide from painting representationally, I guess, to a more abstract mode, not knowing on a given day which way the painting's going to go. And I think it's often the case with painters that describe themselves as process painters, that this is what happens. They might start out with a given intention, but actually they start putting some paint on the canvas, and as you put a paint on the canvas and look at the paint that you've put on the canvas, that leads you to the next stage, and then you stop and look again and paint again. You shift back and forth between being the spectator and being the originator of the painting, and where you wind up may be very far from your original intention. And indeed, often that's very satisfying. So this continuity then is something I also find in my own personal experience as I paint. But now let me tell you what I think the problem is that I want to solve. And to do this, I want to focus on representational painting, painting that very clearly is of something, about something. There's some object in the painting which you see, and that's the content of the painting. So I want to look at representational painting in that way and tell you what I think the problems are. The first problem that I think one needs to deal with in an account of representation is to provide some explanation of the relationship between the model or subject and the content or object or what the painting is about. For they may surely not be the same thing. For instance, supposing I'm a more or less traditional painter painting a goddess. So I want to paint a painting of a goddess. As is characteristic, she will be a nude goddess. So I will hire a model, and I will use the model as the basis of the painting. That is, the model will serve as a kind of causal stimulus, as something that's helpful and useful. But it's very interesting. I think it's important to recognize that the painting is about what shows up in it. It's not about the model. The great paintings of nudes are not about hired help. They're about something else. There's the hired help, but that's to take you beyond the hired help so that you can create some object, some intentional object in the painting itself. So there's something in the painting that's not identical with the model or subject, at least in many cases. I don't have any, so here's one instance. Let me give you another one which may help. Here's one that's closer. So here's a building. This is a photograph of a building called the House of Seven Gables. This is the same house that Hawthorne wrote his book, The House of Seven Gables, about. And there's a painting of it. There's some similarities between the two. On the other hand, it wasn't the similarities that motivated me, because in painting it, what I wanted to do was capture the House of Seven Gables in the novel of Hawthorne. And of course, that's from a different time period. So it's much more agrarian, the scene. That is, it's much more of a country scene. Moreover, the house is haunted. So I tried to capture, without overdoing it, some feeling of the hauntedness of the house. The majesty of the tree is mentioned as much and as strongly as the majesty of the house in the novel by Hawthorne, so I gave more attention to the tree. But at any rate, I might have painted the house directly. I actually painted from the photograph. The point is, though, that there are differences that somehow you start from the model or subject. You might be motivated by trying to create resemblance or similarity initially, but I think that rather quickly vanishes. What you're trying to do is to reconfigure things so that there is a new object created, which is the content of the painting. Let me try one more for you here. So here's something from Tucson that some of you may have seen when you were there, Elizabeth anyway, which is a famous rock in a canyon called Finger Rock. So I always thought that it was interesting, and I was impressed by the amount of color that there was. So at any rate, there was my first go at Finger Rock Canyon. Well, you could see some similarities. The Finger Rock is there if you look for it. But in a way, that's not exactly what the painting's about. It's about what's in it, and it's about that content. So the first problem then is a problem of somehow clarifying the relationship between the object in the painting and the model. Of course, you could just say, well, the model is just a causal starting point and that's all there is to it. But I think that won't quite do. There's something about the relationship between the content of the painting and the model that's more interesting than that. Somehow, the painting, I think, is supposed to take you back to the subject. Well, I'll just indicate that it can go further. Here was, as I cut loose a little further, it went to there, and then when I really wanted to get going, it went there. So it starts from the mountain, but it doesn't quite wind up at the mountain. Let me then, so that's the first issue. The second issue is an issue about representation itself, and that's really the more fundamental issue of today's talk. There's something about pictorial representation that has interested a number of people, from Walheim to Gombrich to Goodman. And we can put it this way. There's a certain character to the representation in a painting that is obviously distinct from representation in description. Exactly how to describe the difference may be controversial and to some extent initially unclear, but there are some things which you can say, which is that with respect to description, if I set out to describe Finger Rock and Finger Rock Canyon, I might describe it very completely and very fully, but there's something about any description of it, though the description will itself have a content, it will be about something, but the description itself, that is the words of the description, unless they're poetic, which is a more complicated case, but if they're simply ordinary description, then they can be exchanged for other descriptions, and the other descriptions will be descriptions of the same content. So as I see it, then the descriptions are not, so to speak, connected with the content in the sense that the words or the vehicle are really part of the content. The object of description is really to be transparent and to give us a description of an intentional object where the particular sensory character of the words is often not very important. That's why we have so much trouble with proofreading. Once you, so to speak, get the message and get the content, really the character of the words gets ignored quickly. So it leads to the problem that my colleague Mark Harnish once described by saying there's a proof that any paper that you write has an infinity of typographical errors. The proof is that every time you read it, you find a new one. And the point of that, though, that I think is somewhat significant is how that doesn't matter, that specific character. So what Walheim insisted upon is that representation in a painting has a twofold character. There is a sort of abstract representation of the content, to be sure. I mean, the painting is a painting of a canyon, or it's a painting of a person, or it's a painting of a goddess. and you might give some description of that content, but somehow that doesn't fully capture what the content or what the object of the painting is. It doesn't fully capture any description what the painting is about, because somehow the sensory state or the sensory character, the particular sensory character, is somehow more intrinsically related and related in some more intimate way to the content. It somehow is part of what the content is like. That's, I think, the idea. So somebody might try to describe this, poor soul, and might describe it so well and be so good at description that actually you might pick out this painting from a group of other paintings. Even my paintings of Finger Rock Canyon. But somehow, any description that they might give you would leave something out about what the content of this painting is, because the content of the painting is about that scene painted like that. So there's a certain conflict, if I can put it this way, in this twofold character of representation that's both particular and general at the same time. And so the question is, how can you give an account of that notion of content? Now, I want to add, so there's the problem about the relationship between the model and the content. There's a problem about the relationship between the particular sensory state and the content. And I want to sort of add something which is not often presented in this particular context, but I think there's more to the content of paintings than sort of depicting some scene or some person. There's also emotions. So there's something about part of the content being the expression of emotions. Some paintings are cheerful, some paintings are sad, and I want to suggest that the sadness is in the painting in the way in which other things are in the painting. And the question is, how? So I think that, and want to argue that you can give an account of the content of paintings that will capture the way in which emotion or feeling is in the painting, as well as shapes and forms, when you take seriously this puzzle that the content of a painting involves what it's like to experience that content. The particular sensory state, then, is related in a way that requires explanation. Once you get hold of the right explanation, I think you get the bonus of seeing the way in which emotions can be in the painting at the same time. Well, to head then to the explanation that I want to offer, I want to look at an entirely different issue, because I think it's closely connected, but not obviously so. And that's the that's the problem of the representation of conscious states. In order to get at that problem, which is familiar to a number of you, and which actually I spoke about here a very long time ago, I want to focus on an example that Frank Jackson put before us once. He put it before us as a argument against materialism. He has subsequently decided that it was not an argument against materialism, but the argument in the example, nevertheless, tends to be one that interests us, and I think it's a good way of getting at the content of painting as well as, if I can put it this way, the content of conscious experience. So the example, which is familiar enough so that I will describe it very briefly, involves a master scientist whose name is Mary. Mary is the most brilliant of physical scientists. She knows everything there is to know about the material world. We can imagine her indeed to know more than any of us know. So we can imagine her to be someone who is at some very much more advanced stage of science where, so to speak, nothing is left out of her knowledge. Whatever principles there are, whatever account there is to be given of matter, she knows it. But Mary has this peculiar feature that she has spent her life in a monochromatic room, in a black and white room. So Mary has never seen color. So I will refer to her as monochromatic Mary, just to remind you of her status. So here's monochromatic Mary. And now, Frank Jackson says, supposing somebody shows her an object for the first time, and supposing it's just something red. So Mary now experiences red for the first time. Now there's a problem about, of course, how Mary might get this experience together with her previous knowledge, but suppose she does. So supposing that she recognizes that, recognizes that what she has referred to as red things and what she connects with her physical knowledge of redness is now exemplified by this object. This is now an example of red. She now knows then, at this point, something which she didn't know before. According to Jackson, she knows what the color red is like. So this, you can see how he might have originally have taken this to be an argument against materialism. She had complete knowledge of the material world before, but now she's getting a new bit of knowledge. So there must be something additional. The premise that he used, which he now rejects, is that it follows from that there was a fact that was left out. I think that there may not have been a fact that was left out. That's controversial. I'm not taking sides on that one. But there's some experience which she has. There's some new experience which she has, some new sensory state, and she does now know something. She knows what the color red is like. I think you can easily put this in the that form. She knows that the color red is like that, as she might put it. So that's what it's like. Now the question is, how should we treat this knowledge? The way I want to treat it is this, and this will take us back to painting. I think that there's something about her experience and the way in which it interacts with her cognitive faculties that gives her not only an experience, but a conception of the experience. What I think happens, and I think this is characteristic of us, is that we not only have experiences, but that we do know what they are like. And to know what they are like is, in a way, to generalize. So the generalization, I think, takes this form. There's an exemplar. The conscious state is an example or an exemplar. That exemplar, then, is used by our intellects, our faculties, to represent a certain class of objects, rather, in this case, a certain class of states, or a certain kind of state. So Mary's experience of red gives her knowledge of what red is like because it's now come to represent for her experiences of red. So the individual state, then, this exemplar of red, is at once individual or particular. It is a particular experience, but it is also, I think, something that immediately becomes general for her. That is, it represents a class of experiences. It represents experiences of red things. Let me give you an example which is actually taken from Goodman to help you get at the process and the point of what I'm saying. Goodman's example concerns somebody who wants to know what a certain song is. You talk about a song, and the song might be Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. And you've never heard the song, Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, and so you might wonder what the song is. and then somebody produces an exemplar of it. They sing it. I sing very badly, so I will not sing much of it. But at any rate, you ask me, so what's the song Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star? And I say, twinkle, twinkle, little star. Well, I do it badly, so I won't go on. But at any rate, imagine somebody singing the song, perhaps a beautiful rendition of Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. And now you get a certain singing that represents the song for you. It represents other singings of the song. It's your representation of Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. So it represents, if you want to put this nominalistically, a class of singings. What's very interesting, I think, is that it's also a member of the class. So this singing of Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star represents a class of singing, says Goodman, and it is, of course, also a member of the class that it represents. So in that way, the particular becomes general. The account that I think is a good one of this was actually offered by an 18th century philosopher who I much admire, actually a pair of them, Hume and Reid both. I think the right understanding of Hume, this is an aside for those of you who are historians, but I think the right understanding of Hume's doctrine about impressions and ideas, and about how impressions, which are particular sensory states, become ideas, is that they go through this process. They are an exemplar, and then, as I like to put it, they are exemplarized. That is, we generalize from them. So that happens, I think, Hume thought, automatically as the impression becomes an idea. I only mention that as an interpretation of Hume because Hume actually is much criticized for not being able to give an account of ideas, but I think he did. And I think it's implicit in the work. When, after all, a man of Hume's literary and linguistic sophistication uses the word idea, he means idea. And the idea then, as we know, is something general. All right, so the basic idea, abandoning Hume and Reid's idea was similar. Reid sort of spelled out the process a little more fully. So Reid says there's in effect two components. One is that you have to attend to the particular. There's a famous line from William James about entering the garden and entering a buzzing, blooming confusion. And if you're going to get a conception of a particular color, you have to focus attention to this particular item, to this particular sensory individual, in order to generalize from it. But the second state is we do generalize. So I think that's the right account, and we can discuss it. Those of you who aren't interested in painting might be interested in consciousness. I think it's characteristic of our mentality that conscious states have this feature that we know what they're like. We don't just have the conscious states, whether they're states of color, of experience of color, or of pain, but we get from them a general conception because the particular becomes general through this process of exemplarization, of letting an exemplar represent a class of things, a class of states of which it itself is a member. Now let's go back to painting. I think if we go back to painting, you can, and take on the notion of exemplarization, you can see why it is that paintings are going to have this feature of having a kind of content that somehow involves the particular sensory surface, the particular sensory state. And the reason is that the content of the painting, whether it's of a mountain or of a person, is one that involves, I think, exemplarization. It's the content of Finger Rock Mountain painted like that. It's that content. So the point that I would bring you to then is that there is something general in it. You do have a certain general conception, but the particular sensory state is exemplarized and hence is constitutive of that content for you. If we were to go into philosophy of mind, I would want to argue that there's a certain functional state which gives rise to your understanding of the content, but that the functional state has a sensory state as a constituent of it. So put it this way, there's a certain sensory state that's part and parcel of the content. And it is so because we do have this ability, an ability which we carry on usually automatically to exemplarize and to form a general conception. It's a general conception that involves the particular sensory state as a constituent of it, as an exemplar. I said that I was going to say something about emotion. What the aspect of emotion comes up when you pose the following question. Exemplarization involves generalization. There's no doubt about it. You get a general conception of a painting, of a content of a painting, from exemplarization. So there is some generalization. So the question is, what brings about the generalization? Certain philosophers, like Goodman, have thought it was utterly arbitrary. Others, like Gombrich, thought that it was completely conventional, that there were, so to speak, cognitive schemata that you learn within a culture, and those cognitive schemata, which were conventional, are the basis, then, I would say, on his account, of generalization, of how you generalize. So the question is, should we agree with them that the way in which you generalize as you look at a particular painting, is it completely arbitrary, or is it completely conventional? Well, I think it's important to recognize that there's got to be something in addition. So what I would argue, and I think some of you would probably agree with this, is that the way in which we generalize is also partly determined by our nature, and indeed by certain, I would suggest, encapsulated input-output systems. So you have a certain sensory experience, and that will lead to a certain level of representation, which is encapsulated in this sense. You can't help it. So when you look at the famous example of encapsulation that Jerry Fodor has so insisted upon, is the bent stick in water. You look at the water, and you know the stick isn't bent. You've just put this straight stick in the water, but it still looks bent. So its looking bent, then, is a characteristic of the sensory experience that you're having. The sensory experience is an input to a system that produces an output of representation, in this case of a bent stick. Now, what I want to argue is the important thing about exemplarization is that it brings the particular state, the particular sensory state, into the conception. As I say, it's part and parcel of it. So supposing it does that, supposing that's the way in which we generalize to understand the content of and what paintings are about. Well, in that case, what I would suggest is that they will also be about emotions. Why? Well, it does seem to me, or at least I think the evidence is, that there are encapsulated emotional responses to certain sensory states. So, when you frown at the child, it cries, the baby. When people frown at you, you don't cry anymore. You're past the stage of crying when you're frowned at least most of the time. But you don't like being frowned at, right? If you have to choose between spending your time with people who smile at you and people who frown at you, it's pretty clear which way you will go. So I think there is a sort of incipient, encapsulated response to the frown. The frown, that sort of sensory experience then, as contrasted with a smile, has a representational aspect to it. So if the sensory state then, as I'm suggesting, is a constituent, is part of the content of the painting, then if the sensory state is also one that in some encapsulated way triggers an emotional response, then the emotional response is going to be as much part of the content of the painting as the colors, the shapes, and anything else. Now, of course, I've looked so far at the contribution of nature. I don't mean to deny that there is a contribution of custom and of convention, for surely there is. So how we generalize from the particular in a painting is going to be influenced, as Gombrich said, by our understanding of the conventions of painting, as well as by other aspects of our development and custom of reaction. What I do want to suggest, however, is that if you place too much emphasis on convention and on rule, you miss the point of avant-garde art. So, and of course, for a long time now, every artist wants to be an avant-garde artist, or at least almost everyone. So, supposing then that you're interested in being an avant-garde artist, what does that mean? Well, I think what it means is that you want to present a particular so that people, in such a way that though people will generalize in some old ways, they will generalize in some new ways. In a way, part of the point of the rules of painting for a painter is so that you can learn them and then break them. And it is the satisfaction of breaking the rules that is part of the creative impulse. That's from the standpoint of the painter. From the standpoint of the spectator, then, the artist is attempting to, and I think you understand this, to reconfigure the world. So the artist is, as Walton put it as Wollheim put it, got the wrong man, the wrong W, as Wollheim put it, to encourage a new kind of world making, a reconfiguration. So there's some influences of nature, there's some influences of convention, and then there is the influence and the important influence of novelty and breaking the conventions as they've existed to enter into some new form of world making in the painting. And all of this, I think, is involved in the way in which you exemplarize from the particular. There's your nature, there's the learned conventions, and then there's what the artist is getting you to do. Well, what I want to do next now is this. I've taken you through two of the issues. One is the issue of the way in which the particular object becomes general. That's through what I call exemplarization. I've taken you through, to some extent, the way in which emotions can be contained in the content of the painting. But now what I want to do finally, is to loop back to this issue. The issue with which we began, which is the original subject or model of the painting. Is there anything to be learned now from what we've said about the relationship between the painting, the content of the painting, and the original subject or model of it? What I want to emphasize again is that you mustn't look for too simple a strategy. Goodman says, well, the painting denotes the object, and that's why it's about what it is. I think that though he's developed that view in very ingenious ways, there's something significant left out. And I think I tried to capture it by saying, on the whole, paintings of nudes are not about hired help. So that's not what you're trying to do. That's not the relationship to the subject. I think that the best way of getting at the relationship to the subject when you are interested in the painting, in bringing the viewer back to the original subject or model, which you may or may not be as an artist, is to see the influence on the way in which you may perceive the subject or the model for the painting as a result of looking at the painting. So one of the famous lines about the Mount Sainte-Victoire paintings of Cézanne is to say that Sainte-Victoire will never look the same to you after you've looked at Cézanne's paintings. And I think there's a point to that. So what you do, I think, is this. In creating a certain object or content in the painting, a novel content in the painting, a novel object in the painting, what you do is change the way in which one perceives the original subject or model of the painting. So there's a reconfiguration, or there's a kind of world making in the painting, which I think the artist intends for you to take back to the world after you've looked at the painting. So you get a certain slightly paradoxical result, I think. Sainte-Victoire might look different, and it might resemble now, it might seem to now to resemble the painting. But the reason it resembled the painting, I think, isn't that the person was trying to make, in this case Cézanne, the painting like the mountain. It's rather the other way around. He was trying, in creating something in the painting, some intentional object, some content in the painting, to, in effect, get you to see a resemblance between the object in the painting and that mountain. I think it wouldn't go the other way. And so that's why there is this kind of reconfiguration. I would like to put it in a slightly paradoxical way. By way of ending it, I think there's a kind of loop, which you can put as a loop of meaning, a sort of circle of meaning in the objectives of painting. And the way to look at this loop, I think, is this. When you paint, you tend to look at the object not so much to imitate it, but to ask yourself, well, what does that scene mean to me? You look around, you look at some scenes, and you try to ask yourself what it means. You try to find some meaning in it. If you don't, it can be very hard to paint. But if you do, it gets easier. But how do you find the meaning of the scene when you paint? Well, I think it's because you paint the painting, which itself has a certain meaning, and in painting the painting, which has the meaning that it has, you find the meaning of the object that you're painting. So there's a kind of loop of meaning from the meaning of the painting to the meaning of the object and back. If you ask which comes first, I think it doesn't matter. There's an interaction between the two, because as a painter, you're into the objective or goal of world making anyway, and you take the world as it is and you remake it. And so there is in that a sort of loop of meaning from the world to the object of the painting and back to the world. I want to end with a couple of issues. I've taken this in a very first person mode. So I've given the intention of the artist great play. Of course, it's very convenient because I was talking about my paintings, and so I get to be something of an authority concerning them. I did that with, as we say, malice aforethought. But now I think people can get into discussions about what paintings are about and disagreements. So sometimes people can look at a painting, and I think we tend to be latitudinarian about this. That is, if you, as an artist, if somebody finds something in a painting up to a point, one's very pleased with what they find in it, with the way in which they exemplarize your painting to find some content in it. But of course, sometimes it's just obvious that the interpretations are, as I would say, off the wall. That is, they are just completely wrong. So supposing somebody looks at Picasso's Guernica and looks at it and starts to smile and looks very cheery and says, oh, it's a painting of a carnival. It's a painting of a very cheery carnival. What a pretty painting of a carnival. And you say, oh, that's too much. I mean, it's very nice that people should look at paintings and get out of them what they will. But somehow that's not the content of the painting. That's not what the painting is about. It's not about some pleasant carnival that you're supposed to smile at and find amusing. So the question is then, how are we to interpret this constraint? The first thing you might do is try to appeal to the intention of the artist. I think the intention of the artist should get considerable weight. I just don't think, unfortunately, it's the whole of the story. Matisse was famous for remarking of his patroness that she understood his paintings better than he did. And I think perhaps we should take his word for that. She did. When you look at his painting of her in the San Francisco Art Museum, the Museum of Modern Art, you at any rate are so impressed with the sensitivity of that painting as contrasted with, say, the painting of her husband, which also hangs there and is not very sensitive, that he thought that she did understand him in a way. It's the painting of a woman who you think is insightful and who understood you. So I think we should say, well, the artist's intention, of course, should be given some weight. But sometimes, perhaps, the patroness or the arch interpreter should be given some. When I go to a gallery, I am very pleased with the interpretations that I give, and I enjoy interpreting works of art as I'm inclined. But if I get to go to the gallery with Arthur Danto and enjoy his eyes and his interpretations, I usually find that very instructive. So I am instructed as to what the work is about. And I can see what it's about as a result of his comments sometimes where I did not see what it was about before. So it does seem to me, and I want to suggest that in addition to individual exemplarization, which may be quite arbitrary and quite capricious, just as it may be very insightful and very creative, that there is another sense to be given to the content of it and the content of a work of art. And that I think we should look at in the following model. It's a little bit like the relationship between the meaning of a word and the meaning that a person gives to it in his or her idiolect. So as I speak, and you ask me what I mean, I may be able to tell you. And the meaning of a word in my idiolect may be rather idiosyncratic. But in addition to that, we also think that there's the meaning of the word, say, in French or in English. And so we draw that distinction. I think that's a similar point about the content of the painting. There might be what the painting is about, the meaning of the painting for the individual that might be quite individualistic and idiosyncratic. And in addition to that, we want to talk about the meaning of the painting. The way in which I would get at this, which would be another paper, and I will spare you another hour of unrelenting Lehrer speech, is to think about it as giving certain weight to various people who we think of as being more expert. So I do think in the case of painting that there's some point in the idea that there are certain critics, there are certain people who are knowledgeable and insightful, and as we think, just have really good eyes for art that are worth listening to. And perhaps they, like Matisse's patroness, are people who can give us an insight as to what the paintings are about, which we might not ourselves have. And I think we acquiesce in that and concede to it, and also that we converse about it in considerable detail. So what's involved in the conversation, I think, is this. As we engage in the conversations about art, which we do enjoy, part of the point of the conversation is to learn how much weight we want to give to other people in that conversation. And I think that there's a sort of aggregation of respect that constitutes a kind of social consensus about the content of the work of art. So there's exemplarization at the individual level. There's then a certain aggregation of views based on the respect that we give to art critics and just to other people as a result of the conversations that we have with them about works of art. Some of their conversations may be detailed writings, like Danto's introduction to Mapplethorpe's work. And they convince us then of that perspective, that insight, that view of content. And we then, I think, re-exemplarize. We look at that sensory surface and the content changes. We exemplarize in a new way. And from the new exemplarizations that we make, we may influence others and become art authorities and be part of that aggregation. And so there's a kind of loop between the individual and the group. If you ask me which comes first, the social consensus about content or the individual exemplarization, historically, there might be some argument for the individual, but only in the remote past. At any given one time, the individual is partly individual and partly social, and so will the exemplarization and the content of the work of art be so. So to take a line that was once supplied by my wife, who's here, so I should quote her. I usually just use it and don't bother, but since she's here, I want to be sure to give her credit for it. If you ask which comes first, then the sort of social consensus or the individual exemplarization, I think the problem is like the problem of the chicken and the egg. And the line is, they fly and fry together. Thank you. Richard?
I agree with everything you were saying in the latter part of the paper, but in the early part, I was nervous about the notion of sensory states as constitutive concepts. Suppose you agree with Sellers and David Lewis that monochromatic Mary's concept of red is the same before and after, before she is exposed to colored objects, and after, because a concept is the use of a word or an input-output function, and she has additional input-output functions as a result of what Lewis would call her acquisition of a skill, namely being able to draw off colors just by looking at them. But for philosophers like Lewis and Sellers, you can't have a sensory state as a constitutive part of an input-output function. They're just not, they're not, input-output functions don't have constituents. They're just relations. And I'm sort of sympathetic to this way. And so this way of looking at it, and thus dubious about resurrecting Hume and Reed in order to have a notion of exemplarization. And I wonder whether you couldn't say everything you said in the latter part of the paper just by talking about Cezanne, Danto, and so on as equipping us with further input-output functions.
I think that I guess the way I want to put it is this. There's certainly a take on functional state such that I can't have what I said. So I want to, that is, there's a take on functional states, as you pointed, that's just relational. I think that with respect to, if I can put it this way, a functionalist who's a bit more of a latitudinarian, they might believe that certain states, that certain experiential states, play a role in how we function and play a role in, as you put it, our input-output relations. So the way I'd want to look at the state is that, say with respect to Mary, is that she really has new knowledge, and new knowledge that something is the case, even though no new fact is the basis of it. So take the case, the analogy that I would like to press is the knowledge of somebody knowing, for instance, initially that Mark Twain wrote Tom Sawyer. This is the classic example, and later knowing that Samuel Clemens did. I think that even though Samuel Clemens is Mark Twain, that the person does know something new. There's a new piece of knowledge. And why? Well, the person has a new way of representing it that they didn't have before. It may be the same fact that a certain person wrote a certain book, but they do now have a new way of representing it. And I think that Mary has a new way of representing her conception when she's in that state. With respect to Sellers, let me just as a footnote, I mean, Sellers is a person from whom, in a way, I take this view rather than see as an opposition to it. You know, Sellers thought that you took particular tokens to represent functional roles. That was the point of, say, dot quoting the word red. So you dot quote red. When you dot quote red, you're using the word red in a new way to represent a functional role. So if you're a functionalist and you think that function is meaning, you have some difficulty in saying how people can give an account of meaning, so because since they don't sort of they're not in a position to explain this whole set of input-output relations to characterize the functional role, but they can tell you the meaning. So what are they doing? Well, what they're doing is giving you an exemplar, an example of something that plays the functional role, and saying, okay, I can tell you this much about the functional role. It's the functional role played by this thing. Now, I think sensory states play a similar role, and actually I think that Sellers held that view. Stern and I argued in an article in the History of Philosophy Quarterly that that's the explanation of how Jones suddenly actually is able to add a reporting role onto the theoretical role in the saga of Jones. But at any rate, there's no reason why a functionalist shouldn't take a somewhat expanded view, since the states are obviously real enough. You know, you may not want to buy some certain views about qualia, but there's an experience which she had which she didn't have before. However you want to account for that experience. And that experience can have a functional role in representation. I don't see that as really inconsistent with, as I would put it, a latitudinarian view of functionalism. If you want to be as narrowly functionalist as some philosophers, it won't work. Janan?
Yeah. Learn to accept as a part of the content of the painting, like a person who reacts inappropriately to environment. I mean, you just think, well, they're just not one of us. That's your reaction. They don't share our form of life or something like that. In the case of language, though, we have and we need to have sort of norms in place that govern what counts as a part of the content of a term. And I'm going to use the Salesian term, part of its inferential implications that have some kind of a stronger hold on you. That is, suppose you're, on the stand in a fraud case or something. Did you or did you not represent to the person or say to the person that P? Oh no, I didn't use those very words, and it's not part of my, idiolect that those are the inferential implications of P. You don't get to do that. That is, you're making, when you use words, you're making sort of moves in language games, taking on commitments and obligations that you don't get to opt out of. So there's an additional, I think, an important point of disanalogy between the case of language and the case about inappropriate, non-inappropriate responses to paintings.
I don't think I disagree with that greatly.
I don't think you need to.
Right. I mean, obviously, language fulfills certain functions that impose certain constraints. So we have to have ways to resolve our differences concerning the meanings of words. We don't have to, with respect to the content of paintings, and some people think some people really object to my last line altogether. That is, they think, well, we really shouldn't get into that with respect to painting. We should be completely latitudinarian. Whatever somebody finds in the painting, that's what they find in the painting, and there's really nothing more to be said. I find that notion not one that sort of seems 100% right, but I agree with this. There's nothing built into representation in painting the way there is meaning in language that forces us to constrain our freedoms of usage in the same way. So we have to have that in the case of meaning, and we do have ways to resolve our differences.
You might say something a little bit stronger than that. Well, there's a part of the point of language, precisely to allow us to know how to feed our thoughts into one another. And you can't do that unless you have external norms in place that govern what counts as meaning in the term.
Yeah, I see the difference. I think with respect to art, it depends on how interested one is in communication through art. And at various periods, that differs. If you are very interested in communication, if you're in a period, and I think artists do want to communicate something. They may not know just what it is they want to communicate, which is part of the charm of the process. But at the end of it, they feel if they've got something and they like it, they feel they would like somebody else to understand it. They may not be able to tell them how to understand it, so to speak, but they would like them to understand it. So, though they may enjoy, Picasso, I don't think this is true of Picasso, but some person who painted something like Guernica and found somebody just completely enamored of this scene as a carnival scene, might take a certain pleasure in the fact that they enjoyed the painting and that they found something in it and so on. I think Picasso probably wouldn't have, but if you're very interested in communication, you would also be disappointed that the person so completely failed to get it. So if you're very interested in communication, in short, then the parallel gets a little stronger. I brought it up because I think it's very controversial. And I was, yeah, please.
I brought up the about the notion of aboutness you used at the beginning.
Okay.
If I say Fido is at the door,
Yeah.
there is one individual, and only one individual named Fido, about which the statement is. But if you say that painting, which was taken in front of a model dressed or undressed as aboutness, if you say that the painting is not about the model, but about the deity, the goddess, might as well say that it is about classical ideals or unity or about many other things in this sense. So it seems to me that you're using a notion of aboutness, which is different from the ordinary notion, which requires some kind of uniqueness in the object or individual statement. Whereas in the case of painting, you seem to be, it's a multiple relation. So it's a different relation, something little to do with what we talk about when we talk about this language.
I don't think we have any great disagreement, except I think that you're presupposing something about the primary use of the word about, which I'm not quite sure I agree with. But because we do talk about things that don't exist, we fear things that don't exist, we dream about things that don't exist, and all that seems to be a perfectly natural and legitimate use of that particular word about. So I do agree with you, though, that that there's a notion of, I would say, designation or denotation of the word Fido as a proper name of a dog that is different than this notion of aboutness. It's the relationship between a word and some existent thing, for one thing, while the notion of aboutness that I have is much more influenced by a tradition of Brentano and Meinong, where I allow that there are, that we think about things that don't exist, and that really is no problem. If you think that this, I want to build quite a lot on that. So let me just make another remark to show you the way I would go. Supposing you want to be a nominalist in terms of your ontology, that what you think exists are just individuals. But you also think, well, we do want to talk about properties. Things have properties, like your shirt is green. It's a property of your shirt that it's green. So can you have it both ways? Well, I think that once you realize that, this was Thomas Reid's view about properties, that you can think about things that don't exist, and indeed even predicate truths of things that don't exist, then you can be a nominalist and also talk about properties. You just have to add that, of course, there are things that don't exist. All that exists are individuals. Individuals have properties. Properties have properties. It's just that, unlike the Platonistic view of properties, they don't exist. So I think what I'm suggesting is that you can get some philosophical benefits from accepting a notion of aboutness where things can be about things that don't exist.
Even Meinong and Brentano thought that even though they were very happy to consider non-existent things, they thought that, as far as I know, intentionality is always directed to one object at a time. My point was not about the existence or non-existence of
I see.
Okay. Whatever, but the fact that if we say Fido's at the door, there's one and only one object, an existing object.
I see.
The same thing is about. Whereas if you say that the painting is about the goddess, about classical ideals, about nudity, about whatever, then you have a different. Forget about existence or non-existence. Seems to me that it's multiple relations. So this is another difference.
I'm sorry. Of course, I'm sorry. I missed the point to some extent that you were making. So I think that I put it. A painting could be about war in general. Yeah, so that's true. It could be about that. But it does seem to me also that usually, but not always, it's about war by being about a particular portrayal of a scene of war. So the Guernica, this is a particular portrayal of a particular scene of war, and it's by being about that it's about war in general. It seems to me language is like that too. All right, if I describe a particular scene in a battle, you can say, well, the description was about war, but it was about war in a kind of secondary way by being about something more specific. So if you say Fido is eating, it's a statement about a dog, but it's also a statement about eating. I mean, it's just that it's just the primary thing that it's about is Fido eating. Right? So I'm not sure that distinguished description from painting in terms of aboutness. It's that
you wouldn't say that it's about dogmas in general.
No, it's not about dogmas in general.
You might say that both singular terms and predicates refer in that sense. Right, although it's philosophical jargon, you can say that Fido is at the door, is at the door. It's both about Fido and about being the door.
Right.
But no more than that.
I think actually what you're saying connects away with what Janan was saying. That is, since the purposes of representation in painting are less constrained by communicative purposes, we are more inclined, even though the painting is a painting of a particular battle, to think about and to generalize from the particular scene to war and how horrible it is. Because representation in painting is, in a way, may have as part of its intention to lead us in those paths of reflection. So it is different.
I'm not. Look, I don't want to create too long, but I think you'd better leave the aboutness jargon out. I mean, about. I don't know how you can do that, but it seems to me that it's confusing to say that Guernica is about a particular episode in the work and also about war in general. It seems to be confusing if you take apart those things. I mean, there's one particular scene or one particular thing it's about, and then you generalize, you better use some other term. It's not a terminology.
I understand.
I'm not sure I got what the exemplarization relation was in painting, and so I'll try to say what I thought I understand exactly. And let's take an example. You give a picture of a canyon. When seeing the canyon, you have a certain sensory emotional response to it, and you wanted this sensory emotional response to stand as an example for this type of sensory emotional response. Your painting is supposed to convey this sensory emotional response. so the exemplary relation is initially between your sensory emotional reaction to the canyon and these type of reaction generally, and only derivatively between the painting and this type of relation. Is that it? Or?
That's an interesting view. It may be more interesting than the one I put forward, but it wasn't quite the one I put forward, and I probably wasn't exact enough. What I was thinking of you as exemplarizing is the painting, not the scene. So what I was trying to do is to give an account of what the painting is about, the content of the painting, by arguing that there's a certain sensory experience which is particular as you look at the painting, but you do generalize from it in a certain way. So you're taking that sensory state then as representative of a certain content.
But yeah, but this is the spectator's point of view.
I think it's the artist too. I mean, it's true that causally you start from Finger Rock Canyon. You're looking at that thing out there. But I think, as with the model, though you may go back to it now and then for help, it probably doesn't play quite as salient a role as, or it doesn't play quite the role that people think it does. Like, I think with respect to models, it's very natural to feel a slight embarrassment at the way in which you're ignoring the model. So it's much nicer to have a model who's an artist, because he or she will understand, of course, that you're taking off from this stimulus, and it can be helpful for line and shading and color if you're interested in it. But basically, what you're trying to do is to create an intentional object. But the intentional object is related to the sensory state that you're producing. You're producing a sensory state, and you have a conception then, say, of a woman. The conception of a woman is a woman that looks like this. And so you're bringing in a way, that sensory state as part of the content, but you are generalizing.
So would it be consistent with your view to say that paintings are in a sense always meta-representational? They represent a certain representation of image.
How can I put it? I think that's right, but it's both right and a little misleading. And it's a little misleading because the meta talk, though I like it, does suggest stratification into levels. And the interesting thing about the sensory state, like the singing of the song, is that while it's a member of the class, it also represents the class. And so it's level ambiguous and contains a kind of loop in that way. But I think there is a point to that. To thinking of representation in paintings as kind of meta-representation. But it's meta-representation where the second level goes back down into the first, right? That's the idea, yeah.
I want to know more about the relation between the sensory state and the emotion. Does it get brought together, generalized or exemplarized, or what's the relation exactly between the sensory state of looking at images caused by looking at the picture and the emotions which get triggered by the sensory state?
Good. I didn't say as much about that as I should have. So, what I think that the relationship between the sensory states and the emotions is complicated. So sometimes it's association. But let's take what I think is the more interesting claim, which is that sometimes it's a result of innate mechanisms. So, at least that's what I find. I mean, I start painting, and I say, this painting's going to be a sad painting if I keep going this way. I can't just decide it isn't a sad painting. It's just the sadness is in the painting that way. So I can go with that, or I can undo it. But it's like, it feels very much like the bent stick to me. It's a character of the sensory surface that I represented as sad. So my interpretation of that, then, in that case, was that that kind of input-output relation of representation of sadness to the input, to the sensory input, is probably innate and encapsulated, just a conjecture. Now, you're asking a good question. What is the general, I said that in the case of exemplarization, there's generalization from the particular. So you've got this particular sensory state and you've got generalization. That generalization at that level, I would say, is innately driven. It needn't be, but it is in this case.
So the content has a part which is a generalization of the sensory state and a part which is a generalization of the emotional response.
Yeah. But it's really in the sensory state, right? I mean, it's like if, supposing there's a certain color. I don't think this is quite right. Well, a certain line which one sees as a smile. And so there's a certain line which suggests a smile to you. So it's cheerful. You respond to that. You might not notice that it looks like a smile, but it's just cheerful. The cheerfulness is in it. Now, I think that does the particular there, though it's a line, so you're getting a generalization to a shape. You're also getting a generalization to a feeling. Both are, in a way, being elicited by that sensory state. Actually, I had a sort of pretty painting. Let's see if I can get to it very quickly here. That does, I think, illustrate that rather nicely. Yeah, this one actually, just to show you that I'm not completely egoistic and vain, here's a painting by somebody else. This is by Red Dome. And I think this is, a better reproduction would be more helpful, but I think it's cheery. I think most people think it's a cheerful painting of flowers. I think, though, it helps if it's bigger, if you can see a bigger version of it, that there's a trick in the cheerfulness. And the trick in the cheerfulness, I think, and again, this works better if it's bigger, is if you look right here. You're being tricked. I mean, you don't notice that until you notice it, and then you see there's a little. Actually, it's easier to see it up here, right? There's a little smile in the flower right here, right? I think that works before you notice it. Once you notice it, you laugh because the trick is so cute in a way. But I do think that there's something sort of cheery about the painting. People feel it's a kind of cheery painting before they're sure about why it's. And I think that this is a level at which one's exemplarizing below the level of awareness.
I have difficulties in squaring two sides of your story, because on the one hand you seem, and your answers to the recent questions seem to show this, on the one hand you seem to have a sort of representationist, if you want, view of painting, sort of classical, which goes with also a form of representationist view of salt, and I like it. I like it. I mean, I think it's good to and refreshing to have such a view. But on the other hand, you seem to admit that there is a possibility for you of visiting San Francisco Museum of Modern Art or the MoMA or whatever, with some expert, Arthur Danto or Cambridge or whoever, and that person will guide you through the paintings, and that person will say to you, oh, look, this, for instance, this painting by Francis Bacon, it is quoting a painting by Van Gogh. And actually, somebody might notice, showing your own painting, Keith Lehrer is quoting Monet, or he's quoting some other painter, and actually I found that much of your painting there's a lot of quotation or
it's influence.
So my question is about the problem of, if we want to put it that way, content preservation in your view. I use it because it's a problem that we have also with language and in a sort of representation. We quote, we quote words, we quote what people say, and also we report what people say in testimony. It seems that, on your view, there is a sort of transmission of information from the sensory order to some sort of other order where the painter is producing his work. But on the other hand, we have this sort of testimony of the experts who say to us, this is not about Vincent sur la route d'Arles, but that's about the Van Gogh painting. It's not. It's a quote of a quote. Sometimes, I mean, there is a lot of this phenomenon in the history of art. I mean, people were quoting mythological pictures and so on. So at that point, we feel that there is no content which is preserved, and I have difficulties in seeing how you can have it both ways. That is, if the experts are those who pin down what the picture is about, what its content is, and there is no such thing as sort of preservation of the initial content. It's did you really say that at the end you seem to go into a direction which was, in a sense, the one which was suggested by Dick? That is something where we have lost what the input was. We just have relations. We just have. But on the other hand, you seem to really want to have this sort of view where something goes out of sort of primitive state of representations, and because your canyon. I mean, if I suppose an expert tells me, well, Keith went to an Acapulco and he or to the Prater in Vienna, and that's what he saw. And it would be, suppose the guy is authoritative. Could you deny that your painting is not about the canyon, but about Acapulco?
Those are good questions. I think, first let me make a sort of subjective remark. Okay? It feels to me like when you paint something after a painting, it's very much like when you're painting a scene or a model. I mean, it's what you start from, but the content of your painting may differ from the content of the other one, even though there's a certain resemblance between the two. It seems to me that's... So I would not be inclined to say that simply because you painted something after somebody else, that therefore the content is the same, or there's a certain similarity of content. Now, with respect to the... so that's one point I would want to make. With respect to the issue of the expert, part of that was a tag on at the end, and I just try myself to deal with that issue, that people feel that sometimes you've just got to paint them completely wrong. Now, you're saying, well, once you say that you can be completely wrong about the content of the painting, shouldn't you bring in all the information that an expert might be able to supply in order for you to understand the content? I don't think that's quite right. That is, I think that it might be helpful to have the historical background, and it might not. And the reason is that there is a certain test that we have, and it's the test of exemplarization. I mean, somebody can talk to us about the painting, but we're not going to accede to what the person is saying unless we can see it in the painting. Let me just make one final remark, though, because what you first said made me realize that I had forgotten something in the lecture, which is that I had said that there was continuity between the abstract art and the representational art. And I thought you were going to go that way. And I think that's the connection between the two is that just as you exemplarize typically representational paintings in order to grasp the content, I think you exemplarize or tend to exemplarize abstract paintings. So you quickly catch on to what a Mondrian is. And so just as you look at it, you do generalize from the particular sensory state and form a general concept of a Mondrian. You may be disappointed to discover when you look at some earlier ones that it's not quite right, but still, it's a way of suggesting that the experience of the particular sensory state leads to exemplarization and generalization, and you form a general conception. In this case, it'll be of a Mondrian rather than of a mountain or a group of flowers. Let me come back to your point, though. That was just an aside that I wanted to get in.
So, you mean that there's a form of receptivity that is the Mondrian is about Mondrian, and that's all?
Well, but it stands for a general class. I mean, you have general art.
It says it's me, Mondrian. What the content is.
But it represents Mondrian paintings, and it is a Mondrian painting. That's true. So there's a representational loop, but it also represents for you other Mondrian paintings, which is why you're a little disappointed, perhaps, if you discover that he went a different way. Let me just to take this. You asked about paintings after paintings, so that was this one. Actually, this is not a terribly good reproduction of my own painting, but I like this one, so I painted after it. The colors in this one didn't come out quite right, but I mean, you can see a certain similarity. I picked up on the positioning of some flowers and stuff.
There's a smile in your...
But there's no smile on it. So I guess what I would say is the stimulus then is like the stimulus for like the stimulus of the external object. It's a cause. Maybe once you've painted the master might look different. That may be an advantage or a disadvantage. I mean, people, put a mustache on the Mona Lisa, and they kind of spoil the Mona Lisa for you afterwards. I mean, it's a little bit hard, having seen, the mustache on the Mona Lisa, to go back to the Mona Lisa and see it the way you're supposed to see it. So I think it is one of the features of works of art, as well as other models or subjects, that if you paint them and you repaint them, then the other object looks different.
No, what I was just worrying about was sort of tension which exists between sort of view about consensus of what it's about that you suggested at the end, and the sort of causal chain view and representationist view that you had before, because they seem to me to be potentially contradictory with each other, because if the consensus of the people say it's about this or that, and if we're the same for the famous intentional fallacy and so I suppose that what you want to say is that if there is a consensus, it has to be about something which has already been recognized as a certain form of similarity with another content which was itself intended one way or another by the artist.
I really brought in the consensus thing for two reasons. One is we do argue about what works of art are about. Question, what are we arguing about? And I think that what we are arguing about is perhaps something about what that ideal consensus would be. So that's the first point. I think that explains sort of disagreements about it. But then if you say, well, I'm not interested simply in our discourse or disagreement about what the work of art is about, I'm interested now in what it's about for the individual. Then I think I would want to make the point that how we generalize, that being part of the causal chain. The causal chain involves looking at the individual object, the work of art, then generalizing in a certain way. So how we generalize can be influenced by discourse and by the discourse of experts. So what I'm suggesting is the person might originally look at Guernica's The Carnival. They may then listen to a discourse about the painting, have things pointed out, and then they say, oh yes, I see that. It's not about a carnival. This is a sad painting, not a cheerful one. What's happened then? Well, if they've really seen that in the painting, then I think they've re-exemplarized. That sensory surface is now a sensory surface which represents something different for them than it did before. That seems to me to be the useful function of the social component. So I think I can have it both ways. If I say, okay, the individual has to validate in this causal chain which I've described as exemplarization, the view about content that they're hearing. Otherwise, it just doesn't work for them. We might still disagree about whether that person, there still might be a disagreement about whether that person's conception of the content is acceptable or not. And then I think there's an implicit appeal to an ideal consensus. Oh, sorry. Didn't mean to ignore you for so long.
I have a difficulty with Mary's Jackson and the analogy with painting, which is that with Mary, she has when she goes out of the room, she has an experience of red, and you describe this experience as an experience as if it came to represent for her a class of experiences of red. Right. With a painting, the input and the output are not at the same level, since the spectator, the artist, first has an experience of a canvas, of a 2D surface. Right. And I don't think you would agree to describe that it comes, this experience comes to represent for the spectator a class of experiences of canvas. You see? And so there was something missing in your talk. This was the part of the canvas. So that was my first question. If it was as if there wasn't any canvas, you see, in a painting, listening to your talk. And I'm skeptical about the analogy with Mary on that basis. And my second question was about the fact that you didn't use the word imagination at all in your talk. And I believe actually what you said was very close. But I wonder whether you would agree with this as a description of what you said, which would be so the spectator has a certain sensory states. And then he or she imagines of his or her sensory states that they are, for instance, scenes of man in the painting, that they are emotional states. And instead of just going from, I'm not, is a story with imagination consistent with your story about exemplarization?
Yeah, it is. I sort of in the longer version where I talked about other people talk about the role of make-believe and imagination. And I think that is a component. That's a component of what I call generalization. It's the way in which you generalize. Like you say, I mean, you can just generalize in a non-interesting way and say, well, it's a canvas. But you can generalize in very much more interesting ways once the canvas is painted, of course, and you see things in it. So the generalization that's involved there does involve something like imagination and make-believe. The reason I perhaps didn't place as much emphasis on that is that people want to get an account of representation simply in terms of make-believe. But the problem there is of course, there are many kinds of make-believe that are not pictorial representation. So there's some way in which it's not just make-believe. I can tell you a story, and that's make-believe. But there's some special way in which the painting enters into the imagined scene. And that was why I brought in the exemplarization. There's some way in which the sensory surface is essentially connected with the object that constitutes the make-believe. So the sensory surface is part of the make-believe, is what I'm after. A part of the imagined object.
You promised we were going to say something about abstract, not representational art.
Right. I didn't, no. Okay, I began to say that. What I wanted to suggest is you look at the sensory surface and you exemplarize it. So what I think happens is as you move from representational to more abstract art, you do try to generalize. You try to form some conception of an object. It may be a new kind of object. So it might be a conception of the squares of Albers in space. So you will very easily get a sort of spatial representation, even though Albers probably was not interested in that. But you will very naturally see a sort of spatial representation of something in an abstract painting. So I think that what happens is that the eye tends to exemplarize the surface, to form some general conception, some imagined object, until it's really blocked. I mean, it may get to the point where the abstract artist succeeds actually in blocking that process. And I think that is a kind of achievement. And so the relationship, there's a continuity to a lot of abstract art because there is generalization, exemplarization, in short, some general conception of what's going on in the painting. Then there are minimalists. And the point of minimalists, as one of them once remarked, is I don't want to represent anything. I don't want to allow you to represent anything. I just want to leave my touch on the world. Well, if he succeeds, or she, then there won't be any exemplarization and there will really be a break. I just find in most abstract art that though, you may not find a tree, or you may not find something, you may not find a woman or a man or a building, you do exemplarize to a colored shape in space. Whether or not the artist himself or herself did that, I'm not sure. I think probably Nevelson and Mondrian did. I think as I look at those objects, after all, Mondrian says, I'm a representational painter. In one sense, you say that's crazy. And in another way, well, shapes in space, shapes and colors in space, maybe.
Rothko says the same. He says, I paint rectangles.
I paint rectangles, yeah. Well, and you can see that. I mean, you do have a conception of a Rothko rectangle. It's not just any old rectangle. So we are inveterate generalizers. That's really the connection with the representational case. We generalize from the sensory surface. Sometimes the generalization takes us back to more or less familiar objects, some not. But I think there's a similarity in the process.
So I was wondering if there may be an issue as to whether the contents of the painting is conceptual or fully conceptual, is at least partly non-conceptual. And it's, of course, if the contents of the painting is exhausted by something like picture X painted like that, where like that is an indexical predicate, like that thus or that. It may seem that the content of the painting, in your view, is fully conceptual, from at least one influential account of indexical predicate. They express in context concepts which are tied to recognitional abilities and so on. But someone may object that, there's more to the contents of the painting than just what can be recognized across context or what can be generalized. There are many more specific chromatic details that can't be conceptualized and so can be generalized, I guess, in your view. So my question is do you allow for non-generalizable feature or aspects of the painting?
Sure, they may be important aspects of the painting. In many cases, as in the case of the one I showed you, I think they're also related indirectly to the content of the painting. I mean, the little line like that is, even if you don't focus any attention on it, I think it may influence the content. But if you say, aren't there components of the painting that are part of the painting that may not themselves be exemplarized? I would have to say yes, I agree with you. There are. I mean, even if you go look at a Monet, as he said, I mean, you look at it at a distance and you see the scene. You start to get up very close, and all of a sudden you realize there are all sorts of features that you're not seeing at a distance that are nevertheless in a subtle way connected with it, as the divisionists taught us. If you put the yellow and the purple next to each other, you may get a gray, which is very interesting, of course, at a distance. So I don't want to deny that those are parts of the painting and important parts of the painting. So I guess you just have to distinguish between the components of the sensory surface of the painting and the content. And the former contributes to the latter. And sometimes you might think, as this minimalist does, the other doesn't matter at all. I'm only interested, after all, if you go up and look at the Monet up close, suddenly it occurs to you, some of those strokes are just wonderful. Why not just settle for the stroke? Okay, I don't. So I just think the interesting thing about the account is you generalize as far as you can. At a certain point, somebody may actually be able to paint a painting that blocks that. Maybe Rothko, I'm not sure. But others. And I think that's interesting. I think it's an interesting undertaking of the artist to see how far you have to go in order to block all conception.
There are obstacles to generalization. For instance, when I look at Courbet's L'origine du monde,
Yeah.
I have difficulties to generalize.
Really? Well, there are different powers of generalization.